M. Ranson it says, "We had scarcely appeared when 8 natives, who, upon our first appearance on their coast, had vainly called to us by cries and gestures, appeared suddenly together. After a while 3 of them, who were no doubt women, went away again. The remaining 5, first throwing their assegais to a distance, to convince us, probably, of their pacific intentions, assisted us in landing. At my suggestion, the sailors offered them various presents, which they received with an air of satisfaction, but without enthusiasm. Whether from apathy or as a mark of confidence, they returned the presents to us with a pleased expression, and upon our once more presenting them with the same things, they left them upon the ground or surrounding rocks. They were accompanied by many large and handsome dogs. I did all I could to induce them to part with one. I offered them all I had, but their refusal was persistent. They probably employed them in hunting the kangaroo, which, with the fish that I had seen them pierce with their assegais, formed their staple food. They drank some coffee and ate some salt beef and biscuits, but refused the bacon we offered, and left it behind them upon the stones without touching it. These natives are tall, thin, and very active. They have long hair, black eyebrows, short flat noses, sunken eyes, large mouths with projecting lips and fine and very white teeth. The inside of their mouths seemed as black as the outside of their bodies. The 3 who appeared the oldest among them, and who might have been from 40 to 50 years of age, had large black beards. Their teeth appeared to have been filed, and the cartilage of the nose pierced. Their hair was trimmed and curled naturally. The other 2, whose ages we took to be from 16 to 18, were not tattooed at all. Their long hair was gathered into a chignon, powdered with red dust, similar to that which the elder ones had rubbed over their bodies. They were all naked, and wore no ornament, excepting a large waistband, composed of a number of small fringed strips of kangaroo skin. They talked volubly, and sang in snatches, but always in the same key, and accompanied their song with the same gestures. In spite of the friendly feeling which continued to exist between us, they never allowed us to approach the spot where the other natives, probably their wives, were hidden. After a stay of 12 days in King George's Harbor, the explorers again put to sea. They rectified and completed the maps drawn by 500 Entrecast and Vancouver of Lecken, Edel, and Indrant lands, which were in turn visited and surveyed, between the 7th and the 26th of March. Thence Baudin proceeded to De Witt Land, which was almost unknown when he visited it the first time. He hoped to succeed better than De Witt, Vianen, Dampier, and St. Alwan, who had all been unsuccessful in their efforts to explore it. But the breakers, reefs, and sandbanks rendered navigation extremely perilous. A new source of danger shortly afterwards arose, in the singular illusion of the mirage. The effect, says the narrative, was to make the geograph appear to be surrounded by reefs, although at the time she was a full league away from them, and every one on board the Casuarina imagined her to be in the most imminent danger. Only when it became too exaggerated to be real was the magic of the illusion dispelled. Upon the 3rd of May, the 2 vessels once more cast anchor in Kupang Port, Timor Island. 1 month later, after revictualling, Captain Baudin set sail for De Witt Land, where he now hoped to find the winds favorable for an advance to the east. From thence he proceeded to Mauritius, where he died upon the 16th of September, 1803. It appears probable that the precarious state of his health had some influence upon his conduct of this expedition, and possibly his staff would have had less reason to complain of him had he been in full possession of all his faculties. This, however, is a question for psychologists to decide. Water carrier at Timor. Water carrier at Timor. Facsimile of early engraving. The geograph entered Lorient roadstead upon the 23rd of March, and 3 days later the vast collection of natural curiosities was landed. The narrative says, besides an immense number of cases, containing minerals, dried plants, fish, reptiles, and zoophytes preserved in brandy, stuffed or dissected quadrupeds and birds, we had 70 large cases filled with vegetables in their natural state, comprising nearly 200 species of useful plants and about 600 varieties of seeds. In addition to all this, at least 100 living animals. We cannot better complete our account of the results of this expedition than by giving an extract from the report laid before the government by the Institute, relating more particularly to the zoological collection made by M. Perron and Lesueur. It comprises more than 100,000 specimens of large and small animals. Many important new species are already recognized, and there still remain, according to the statement made by the professor at the museum, upwards of 2,500 to be classified. When we reflect that Cook's second voyage, the most successful undertaken up to this period, had produced only 250 specimens. That the united voyages of Carteret, Wallis, Furneaux, Mears, and even Vancouver had not accumulated so many, and when we admit that the same statement applies to all succeeding French expeditions, it is evident that Perron and Lesueur introduced more new animals to Europe than all other modern travelers put together. Moreover, the geographical and hydrographical results were considerable. The English government has always refused to acknowledge them, and Desparts Cooley, in his History of Voyages, subordinates Baudin's discoveries to those of Flinders. It was even suggested that Flinders was detained prisoner at Mauritius for 6 years and a half, in order to allow French authors time to consult his maps and arrange the details of their voyages accordingly. This accusation is too absurd to need refutation. The two navigators, French and English, have each fairly earned a place in the history of the discovery of the Australian coasts, and it is unnecessary to praise one at the expense of the other. In the preface to the second edition of his Voyage de la Corvette Australis, which was revised and corrected by Louis de Freycinet, Perron has given each his due meed of praise, and to his able work we refer all readers who are interested in the question. Chapter 2. African Explorers. Shaw in Algeria and Tunis, Horneman in Fezzan, Adamson at Senegal, Houghton in Senegambia, Mungo Park in his two voyages to the Djeliba, or Niger, Sego, Timbuktu, Sparman, and Levaillant at the Cape, at Natal, and in the interior, Lacerda in Mozambique, and at Kazumb, Bruce in Abyssinia, sources of the Blue Nile, Tizana Lake, Brown's journey in Darfur. An Englishman named Thomas Shaw, a chaplain in Algeria, had profited by his 12-year stay in Barbary to gather together a rich collection of natural curiosities, medals, inscriptions, and various objects of interest. Although he himself never visited the southern portion of Algeria, he availed himself of the facts he was able to obtain from well-informed travelers, who imparted to him a mass of information concerning the little-known and scarcely visited country. He published a book in 2 large quarto volumes, which embraced the whole of ancient Numidia. Map of part of North Africa. It was rather the work of a learned man than the account of a traveler, and it must be admitted that the learning is occasionally ill-directed. But in spite of its shortcomings as a geographical history, it had a large value at the time of its publication, and no one could have been better situated than Shaw for collecting such an enormous mass of material. The following extract may give an idea of the style of the work. The chief manufacture of the Kabyles and Arabs is the making hikes, as they call their blankets. The women alone are employed in this work. Like Andromache and Penelope of old, they do not use the shuttle, but weave every thread of the woof with their fingers. The usual size of a hike is 6 yards long and 5 or 6 feet broad, serving the Kabyle and Arab as a complete dress during the day, and as a covering for the bed at night. It is a loose but troublesome garment, as it is often disarranged and slips down, so that the person who wears it is every moment obliged to tuck it up and rearrange it. This shows the great use there is of a girdle whenever men are in active employment, and explains the force of the scripture injunction of having our loins girded. The method of wearing this garment, with the use it is at other times put to as bed covering, makes it probable that it is similar to, if not identical with, the peplus of the ancients. It is likewise probable that the loose garment flung over the shoulder, the toga of the Romans, was of this kind, as the drapery of statues is arranged very much in the same manner as the Arab hike. It is unnecessary to linger over this work, which has little interest for us. We shall do better to turn our attention to the journey of Frederick Conrad Horneman to Fezzan. This young German offered his services to the African Society of London, and, having satisfied the authorities of his knowledge of medicine and acquaintance with the Arabic language, he was engaged and furnished with letters of introduction, safe conducts, and unlimited credit. Leaving London in July 1797, he went first to Paris. Lalande introduced him to the Institute and presented him with his Memoire sur l'Afrique, and Brausenet gave him an introduction to a Turk from whom he obtained letters of recommendation to certain Cairo merchants who carried on business in the interior of Africa. During his stay at Cairo, Horneman devoted himself to perfecting his knowledge of Arabic and studying the manners and customs of the natives. We must not omit to mention that the traveler had been presented by Monge and Berthelot to Napoleon Bonaparte, who was then in command of the French forces in Egypt. From him, he received a cordial welcome, and Bonaparte placed all the resources of the country at his service. He received a cordial welcome. He received a cordial welcome. As the safer method of traveling, Horniman resolved to disguise himself as a Mohammedan merchant. He quickly learned a few prayers and adopted a style of dress likely to impose upon unsuspecting people. He then started, accompanied by a fellow countryman named Joseph Frendenberg, who had been a Mussulman for more than 12 years, had already made 3 pilgrimages to Mecca, and was perfectly familiar with the various Turkish and Arabic dialects. He was to act as Horniman's interpreter. On the 5th of September, 1798, the traveler left Cairo with a caravan and visited the famous oasis of Jupiter Ammon or Siwa, situated in the desert on the east of Egypt. It is a small, independent state which acknowledges the Sultan, but is exempt from paying tribute. The town of Siwa is surrounded by several villages, at distances of a mile or two. It is built upon a rock in which the inhabitants have hollowed recesses for their dwellings. The streets are so narrow and intricate that a stranger cannot possibly find his way among them. This oasis is of considerable extent. The most fertile portion comprises a well-watered valley, about 50 miles in circumference, which is productive of corn and edible vegetables. Dates of an excellent flavor are its most valuable export. Horniman was anxious to explore some ruins which he had noticed, for he could obtain little information from the natives. But every time he penetrated to any distance in the ruins, he was followed by a number of the inhabitants, who prevented him from examining anything in detail. One of the Arabs said to him, "You must still be a Christian at heart, or you would not so often visit the works of the infidels." This remark put a speedy end to Horniman's further explorations. As far as his superficial examination enabled him to judge, it was really the oasis of Ammon, and the ruins appeared to him to be of Egyptian origin. The immense number of catacombs in the neighborhood of the town, especially on the hill overlooking it, indicate a dense population in ancient times. The traveler endeavored vainly to obtain a perfect head from one of these burial places. Amongst the skulls he procured, he found no certain proof that they had been filled with resin. He met with many fragments of clothing, but they were all in such a state of decay that it was impossible to decide upon their origin or use. After a stay of 8 days in this place, Horniman crossed the mountains which surrounded the oasis of Siwa and directed his steps towards Skyada. So far no misfortune had interrupted his progress. But at Skyada, he was denounced as a Christian and a spy. Horniman cleverly saved his life by boldly reading out a passage in the Quran which he had in his possession. Unfortunately, his interpreter, expecting that his baggage would be searched, had burned the collection of fragments of mummies, the botanical specimens, the journal containing the account of the journey, and all the books. This loss was quite irreparable. A little further on, the caravan reached Augila, a town mentioned by Herodotus, who places it some 10 days' journey from the oasis of Ammon. This accords with the testimony given by Horniman, who reached it in 9 days' forced march. At Augila, a number of merchants from Benghazi, Merote, and Macamba had joined the caravan, amounting altogether to no less than 120 persons. After a long journey over a sandy desert, the caravan entered a country interspersed with hills and ravines, where they found trees and grass at intervals. This was the desert of Harach. It was necessary to cross it in order to reach Temissa, a town of little note, built upon a hill and surrounded by a high wall. At Zuila, the Fezan country was entered. The usual ceremonies, with interminable compliments and congratulations, were repeated at the entrance to every town. The Arabs appear to lay great stress upon these salutations, little trustworthy as they are, and travelers constantly express surprise at their frequent recurrence. Upon the 17th of November, the caravan halted at Merzuk, the capital of Fezan. It was the end of the journey. Horniman says that the greatest length of the cultivated portion of Fezan is about 300 miles from north to south, but to this must be added the mountainous region of Harach on the east and the various deserts north and west. The climate is never pleasant. In summer the heat is terrible, and when the wind blows from the south, it is all but insupportable, even to the natives, and in winter the north wind is so cold that they are obliged to have recourse to fires. The produce of the country consists principally of dates and vegetables. Merzuk is the chief market. There are collected the products of Cairo, Benghazi, Tripoli, Ghadames, Ghot, and the Soudan. Among the articles of commerce are male and female slaves, ostrich feathers, skins of wild beasts, and gold dust or nuggets. Bornu produces copper, Cairo silks, calicoes, woolen garments, imitation coral, bracelets, and Indian manufactures. Firearms, sabers, and knives are imported by the merchants of Tripoli and Ghadames. The Fezan country is ruled by a sultan descended from the sheriffs, whose power is limitless. but who, nevertheless, pays a tribute of $4,000 to the Bey of Tripoli. Horniman, without giving the grounds of his calculation, informs us that the population amounts to 75,000 inhabitants, all of whom profess Mohammedanism. Horniman's narrative gives a few more details of the manners and customs of the people. He ends his report to the African Society by saying that he proposes visiting Fezzan again in the hope of obtaining new facts. We learn, further, that Frendenberg, Horniman's faithful associate, died at Merzuk. Attacked by a violent fever, Horniman was forced to remain much longer than he desired in that town. While still only partially recovered, he went to Tripoli for change and rest, hoping there to meet with Europeans. Upon the 1st of December 1799, he returned to Merzuk and left it finally with a caravan upon the 7th of April, 1800. He was irresistibly attracted towards Bornu and perished in that country, which was to claim so many victims. During the 18th century, Africa was literally besieged by travelers. Explorers endeavored to penetrate into it from every side. More than one succeeded in reaching the interior, only to meet with repulse or death. The discovery of the secrets of this mysterious continent was reserved for our own age, when the unexpected fertility of its resources has astonished the civilized world. The facts relating to the coast of Senegal needed confirmation, but the French superiority was no longer undisputed. The English, with their earnest and enterprising character, were convinced of its importance in the development of their commerce, and determined upon its exploration. But before proceeding to the narrative of the adventures of Major Houghton and Mungo Park, we will devote a small space to the record of the work done by the French naturalist, Michel Adanson. Devoted from early youth to the study of natural history, Adanson wished to become famous by the discovery of new species. It was hopeless to dream of obtaining them in Europe, and, in spite of opposition, Adanson selected Senegal as the field of his labors. He says, in a manuscript letter, that he chose it because it was the most difficult to explore of all European settlements, and, being the hottest, most unhealthy, and most dangerous, was the least known by naturalists. Certainly a choice founded upon such reasoning gave proof of rare courage and ambition. It is true that Adanson was by no means the first naturalist to encounter similar dangers, but he was the first to undertake them, with so much enthusiasm, at his own cost, and without hope of reward. Upon his return, he had not sufficient money to pay for the publication of his account of the discoveries he had made. Embarking upon the 3rd of March, 1749, on board the Chevalier Marin, commanded by 500 apres de Manivelet, he touched at Santa Cruz, Tenerife, and disembarked at the mouth of the Senegal, which he took to be the Niger of ancient geographers. During nearly 5 years, he was engaged in exploring the colony in every direction, visiting in turn Poder, Portugal, Albreda, and the mouth of the Gambia. With unceasing perseverance, he collected a rich harvest of facts in the animal, vegetable, and mineral kingdoms. To him is due the first exact account of a gigantic tree called the baobab, which is often called Adansonia after him, of the habits of the grasshoppers, which form the chief food of certain wild tribes, of the white ants and the dwellings they construct, and of a certain kind of oyster, which attach themselves to trees at the mouth of the Gambia. He says, "The natives have not the difficulty one might anticipate in catching them. They simply cut off the bough to which they cling. They often cluster to the number of over 200 on one branch, and if there are several branches, they form a bunch of oysters such as a man could scarcely carry." It's the baobab. It's the baobab. In spite of the interest of these and similar discoveries, there are few new facts for the geographer to glean. A few words about the Yalofs and Mandingos comprise all there is to learn. If we followed Adanson throughout his explorations, we should gain little fresh information. The same cannot be said of the expedition, of which we are about to give some account. Major Houghton, captain in the 69th Regiment, and English governor of the fort of Gori, had been familiar from his youth, part of which was passed with the English embassy in Morocco, with the manners and customs of the Moors and the Negroes of Senegambia. In 1790, he proposed to the African Society to explore the course of the Niger, penetrate as far as Timbuktu and Hausa, and return by way of the Sahara. The carrying out of this bold plan met with but one obstacle, but that was almost sufficient to upset it. Houghton left England upon the 16th of October, 1790, and anchored in Gillifrey Harbour at the mouth of the Gambia upon the 10th of November. Well received by the King of Beira, He followed the course of the Gambia to a distance of 300 leagues, traversed the remainder of Senegambia, and reached Gonda Konda in Yanvi. Walkner, in his History of Voyages, says, he purchased a negro, a horse, and 5 asses, and prepared to proceed with the merchandise which was to pay his expenses to Mendana, the capital of the little kingdom of Woolly. Fortunately, his slight knowledge of the Mandingo language enabled him to understand a negress who was speaking of a plot against him. The merchants trading on the river, imagining commerce to be his sole object, and fearing that he might compete with them, had determined upon his death. In order to avoid the threatened danger, he thought it wise to deviate from the usual route, and, accordingly, crossed the river with his asses, and reached the northern shore in the kingdom of Cantor. Houghton then crossed the river a second time, and entered the kingdom of Woolly. He at once sent a messenger to the king, bearing presents and asking for protection. He was cordially received, and the traveler was welcomed to Mendana, the capital, which he describes as an important town, situated in the midst of a fertile country, in which many herds of cattle graze. Houghton was justified in anticipating a successful issue to his voyage. Everything appeared to presage it, when an event occurred which was the first blow to his hopes. A hut next that in which he slept took fire, and the whole town was soon in flames. His interpreter, who had made several attempts to rob him, seized this opportunity and fled with a horse and 3 asses. Still the king of Woolly continued his protection of the traveler, and loaded him with presents, precious not on account of their value, but as signs of the goodwill which they demonstrated. This friend of the Europeans was named Jota. Humane, intelligent, and good-hearted, he wished the English to establish a factory in his kingdom. Houghton, in a letter to his wife, says, Captain Littleton, during a stay of 4 years here, has amassed a considerable fortune. He possesses several ships which trade up and down the river. At any time one can obtain, for the merest trifle, gold, ivory, wax, and slaves. Poultry, sheep, eggs, butter, milk, honey, and fish are extremely abundant, and for £10 sterling a large family might be maintained in luxury. The soil is dry, the air very healthy, and the King of Woolly told me that no white man had ever died at Fataconda. Houghton then followed the Falim River as far as Cacullo, which in 500 Anvil's map is called Caquelin, and whilst in Bambouk gleaned a few facts about the Jaliba River, which runs through the interior of the Soudan. The direction of this river he ascertained to be southward as far as Jenne, then west by east to Timbuktu, facts which were later confirmed by Mungo Park. The traveler was cordially received by the king of Bambouk, who provided him with a guide to Timbuktu and with cowries to pay his expenses during the journey. It was hoped that Houghton would reach the Niger without accident, when a note, written in pencil and half effaced, reached Dr. Laidley. It was dated from Simming, and stated that the traveler had been robbed of his baggage, but that he was prosecuting his journey to Timbuktu. This was followed by accounts from various sources, which gave rise to a suspicion that Houghton had been assassinated in Bambara. His fate was uncertain until it was discovered by Mungo Park. Walkner says, Simming, where Houghton wrote the last words ever received from him, is a little walled town on the frontier of the kingdom of Ludemir. Here he was abandoned by his Negro servants, who were unwilling to accompany him to the country of the Moors. Still he continued his route, and, after surmounting many obstacles, he advanced to the north, and endeavored to cross the kingdom of Ludemir. Finally he reached Yaouri, and made the acquaintance of several merchants, on their way to sell salt at Tishit, a town situated near the marshes of the Great Desert, and 6 days' journey north of Yaouri. Then, by bribing the merchants with a gun and a little tobacco, he persuaded them to conduct him to Tishit. All this would lead us to suppose that the Moors deceived him, either as to the route he should have followed, or as to the state of the country between Yaouri and Timbuktu. After 2 days' march, Houghton, finding himself deceived, wished to return to Yaouri. The Moors robbed him of all he possessed and fled. He was forced to reach Yaouri on foot. Did he die of hunger, or was he assassinated by the Moors? This has never been rightly determined, but the spot where he perished was pointed out to Mungo Park. The loss of Houghton's journals, containing the observations made during his journey, deprived science of the result of all his fatigue and devotion. To ascertain what he accomplished, one must have recourse to the proceedings of the African Society. At this time Mungo Park, a young Scotch surgeon, who had just returned from a voyage to the East Indies on board the Worcester, learnt that the African Society were anxious to find an explorer willing to penetrate to the interior of the country, watered by the Gambia. Mungo Park, who had long wished to acquaint himself with the productions of the country and the manners and customs of the inhabitants, offered his services. He was not deterred by the apprehension that his predecessor, Houghton, had probably perished. Portrait of Mungo Park. Portrait of Mungo Park. Facsimile of early engraving. At once accepted by the Society, Mungo Park hastened his preparations and left Portsmouth upon the 22nd of May, 1795. He was furnished with introductions to Dr. Laidley and a credit of £200 sterling. Landing at Gillifrey, at the mouth of the Gambia, in the kingdom of Barra, and following the river, he reached Pisania, an English factory belonging to Dr. Laidley. He directed his attention first to acquiring a knowledge of the Mandingo language, which was most generally used, and in collecting the facts most likely to be useful in the execution of his plans. His stay here enabled him to obtain more accurate information than his predecessors with regard to the Feloops, the Yalofs, the Fulas, and the Mandingos. The Feloops are morose, quarrelsome, and vindictive, but faithful and courageous. The Yalofs are a powerful and warlike nation, with very black skins. Except in color and speech, they resemble the Mandingos, who are gentle and sociable. Tall and well-made, their women are, comparatively speaking, pretty. Lastly, the Fulas, who are the lightest in color, seem much attached to a pastoral and agricultural life. The greater part of these populations are Mohammedans and practice polygamy. Upon the 2nd of December, Mungo Park, accompanied by 2 Negro interpreters and with a small quantity of baggage, started for the interior. He first reached the small kingdom of Woolly, the capital of which, Medina, comprises 1,000 houses. He then proceeded to Collar, a considerable town, and after 2 days' march across a desert, entered the kingdom of Bondu. The natives are Fulas, professing the Mohammedan religion. They carry on a brisk trade in ivory, when they are not engaged in agriculture. The traveler soon reached the Falim River, the bed of which, near its source in the mountains of Dalaba, is very auriferous. He was received by the king at Fataconda, the capital of Bondu, and had great difficulty in convincing him that he traveled from curiosity. His interview with the wives of the monarch is thus described. Mungo Park says, "I had scarcely entered the court when I was surrounded by the entire seraglio. Some begged me for physic, some for amber, and all were most desirous of trying the great African specific of bloodletting. They are 10 or 12 in number, most of them young and handsome, wearing on their heads ornaments of gold or pieces of amber. They rallied me a good deal upon different subjects, particularly upon the whiteness of my skin and the length of my nose. They insisted that both were artificial. The first, they said, was produced, when I was an infant, by dipping me in milk, and they insisted that my nose had been pinched every day till it had acquired its present unsightly and unnatural conformation." Leaving Bondu by the north, Mungo Park entered Kajaga, called by the French Galem. The climate of this picturesque country, watered by the Senegal, is far healthier than that of districts nearer the coast. The natives call themselves Sarawalis and are called Sarakalits by the French. The color of their skin is jet black, and in this respect they are scarcely distinguishable from the Yalofs. Mungo Park says, "The Sarawalis are habitually a trading people. They formerly carried on a great commerce with the French in gold dust and slaves, and still often supply the British factories on the Gambia with slaves. They are famous for the skill and honesty with which they do business." Natives of Senegal. Natives of Senegal. At Jogue, Mungo Park was relieved of half his property by the envoys of the king, under pretense of making him pay for the right to pass through his kingdom. Fortunately for him, the nephew of Dembajigo Jala, king of Kassin, who was about to return to his country, took him under his protection. They reached Gongadi, where there are extensive date plantations, together, and thence proceeded to Samia, on the shores of the Senegal, on the frontiers of Kassin. The first town met with in this kingdom was that of Taisi, which was reached by Mungo Park on the 31st of December. Well received by the natives, who sold him the provisions he needed at a reasonable price, the traveler was subjected by the brother and nephew of the king to endless indignities. Leaving this town upon the 10th of January, 1796, Mungo Park reached Kuniakari, the capital of Kassin, a fertile, rich, and well-populated country, which can place 40,000 men under arms. The king, full of kindly feeling for the traveler, wished him to remain in his kingdom as long as the wars between Kassin and Kajaga lasted. It was more than probable that the countries of Karta and Bambara, which Mungo Park wished to visit, would be drawn into it. The advice of the king to remain was prudent, and Park had soon reason enough to regret not having followed it. But, impatient to reach the interior, the traveler would not listen, and entered the level and sandy plains of Karta. He met crowds of natives on the journey who were flying to Kassan to escape the horrors of war. But even this did not deter him. He continued his journey until he reached the capital of Karta, which is situated in a fertile and open plain. He was kindly received by the king, Daisy Kurabari, who endeavored to dissuade him from entering Bambara, and, finding all his arguments useless, advised him to avoid passing through the midst of the fray by entering the kingdom of Ludemir, inhabited by Moors. From thence he could proceed to Bambara. During his journey, Mungo Park noticed Negroes who fed principally upon a sort of bread made from the berries of the lotus, which tasted not unlike gingerbread. This plant, the Rhamnus lotus, is indigenous in Senegambia, Nigrisha, and Tunis. So, says Mungo Park, there can be little doubt of this fruit being the lotus mentioned by Pliny as the food of the Libyan Lotafagi. I have tasted lotus bread, and think that an army may very easily have been fed with it, as is said by Pliny to have been done in Libya. The taste of the bread is so sweet and agreeable that the soldiers would not be likely to complain of it. On the 22nd February, Mungo Park reached Jera, a considerable town, with houses built of stone, inhabited by Negroes from the south who had placed themselves under the protection of the Moors, to whom they paid considerable tribute. From Ali, king of Ludemir, the traveler obtained permission to travel in safety through his dominions. But in spite of this safe conduct, Park was almost entirely despoiled by the fanatical Moors of Jenne. At Sampaka and Dali, large towns, and at Samia, a small village pleasantly situated, he was so cordially welcomed that he already saw himself in fancy arrived in the interior of Africa, when a troop of soldiers appeared, who led him to Benown, the camp of King Ali. Ali, says Mungo Park, was sitting upon a black morocco cushion, clipping a few hairs on his upper lip, a female attendant holding a looking-glass before him. He was an old man of Arab race with a long white beard, and he looked sullen and angry. He surveyed me with attention, and inquired of the Moors if I could speak Arabic. Being answered in the negative, he appeared surprised and continued silent. The surrounding attendants, and especially ladies, were much more inquisitive. They asked 1,000 questions, inspected every part of my apparel, searched my pockets, and obliged me to unbutton my waistcoat to display the whiteness of my skin. They even counted my toes and fingers, as if they doubted whether I was in truth a human being. An unprotected stranger, a Christian, and accounted a spy, Mungo Park was a victim to the insolence, ferocity, and fanaticism of the Moors. He was spared neither insults, outrages, nor blows. They attempted to make a barber of him, but his awkwardness in cutting the hairy face of the king's son exempted him from this degrading occupation. During his captivity, he collected many particulars regarding Timbuktu, which is so difficult of access to Europeans, and was the bourne of all early African explorers. Hausa, a sheriff told him, is the largest town I have ever seen. Walet is larger than Timbuktu, but as it is farther from the Niger, and its principal trade is in salt, few strangers are met there. From Benown to Walet is a distance of 6 days' journey. No important town is passed between the two, and the traveler depends for sustenance upon the milk procurable from Arabs, whose flocks and herds graze about the wells and springs. The road leads for 2 days through a sandy desert, where not a drop of water is to be had. It takes 11 days to go from Walet to Timbuktu, but water is not so scarce on this journey, which is generally made upon oxen. At Timbuktu, there are a number of Jews who speak Arabic and use the same forms of prayer as the Moors. Map of Western Africa. The events of the war decided Ali to proceed to Jera. Mungo Park, who had succeeded in making friends with the Sultan's favorite, Fatima, obtained permission to accompany the king. The traveler hoped, by nearing the scene of action, to manage to escape. As it happened, the king of Karta, Daisy Kurabari, soon after marched against the town of Jera. The larger number of inhabitants fled, and Mungo Park did the same. He soon found means to get away, but his interpreter refused to accompany him. He was forced to start for Bambara alone, and destitute of resources. The first town he came to was Wara, which properly belongs to Karta, but was then paying tribute to Mansong, king of Bambara. Mungo Park says, upon the morning of the 7th of July, as I was about to depart, my landlord, with a great deal of diffidence, begged me to give him a lock of my hair. He had been told, he said, that white men's hair made a Sapphic talisman that would give the possessor all the knowledge of the white man. I had never before heard of so simple a mode of education, but I at once complied with the request, and my landlord's thirst for learning was so great that he cut and pulled at my hair till he had cropped one side of my head pretty closely. and would have done the same with the other had I not signified my disapprobation, assuring him that I wished to reserve some of this precious material for a future occasion. First Gallon and then Merja, a large town famous for its trade in salt, were passed, after fatigues and incredible privations. Upon nearing Sego, Mungo Park at last perceived the Jaliba. Looking forward, he says, I saw, with infinite pleasure, the great object of my mission, the long-sought-for majestic Niger, glittering in the morning sun, as broad as the Thames at Westminster, and flowing slowly to the eastward. I hastened to the brink, and having drunk of the water, lifted up my fervent thanks in prayer to the great ruler of all things for having thus far crowned my endeavors with success. The fact of the Niger flowing towards the east did not, however, excite my surprise. For, although I had left Europe in great hesitation on this subject, and rather believed it ran in the contrary direction, I had made frequent inquiries during my progress and had received from Negroes of different nations such clear and decisive assurances that its course was towards the rising sun as scarce left any doubt in my mind, more especially as I knew that Major Houghton had collected similar information in a similar manner. Sego, the capital of Bambara, at which I had now arrived, consists, properly speaking, of four distinct towns, two on the northern bank of the river called Sego Koro and Sego Bu, and two on the southern bank called Sego Su Koro and Sego Si Koro. They are all surrounded with high mud walls. The houses are built of clay, of a square form, with flat roofs. Some of them have 2 stories, and many of them are whitewashed. Besides these buildings, Moorish mosques are seen in every quarter, and the streets, though narrow, are broad enough for every practical purpose in a country where wheel carriages are unknown. From the best information I could obtain, I have reason to believe that Sego contains altogether about 30,000 inhabitants. The king of Bambara resides permanently at Sego Sikoro. He employs a great many slaves in conveying people over the river, and the money they take, though the fare is only 10 cowries for each person, furnishes a considerable revenue to the king in the course of a year. By advice of the Moors, the king refused to receive the traveler, and forbade him to remain in his capital, where he could not have protected him from ill treatment. However, to divest his refusal of all appearance of ill will, he sent him a bag containing 5,000 cowries, of the value of about £1 to buy provisions. The messenger sent by the king was to serve as guide as far as Sandsending. Protest and anger were alike impossible. Mungo Park could do nothing but follow the orders sent. Before reaching Sandsending, he was present at the harvest of vegetable butter, which is the produce of a tree called she. These trees, says the narrative, grow in great abundance all over this part of Bambara. They are not planted by the natives, but are found growing naturally in the woods, and in clearing land for cultivation, every tree is cut down but the she. The tree itself very much resembles the American oak. The fruit, from the kernel of which, after it has been dried in the sun, the butter is prepared by boiling in water, has somewhat the appearance of a Spanish olive. The kernel is embedded in a sweet pulp, under a thin green rind, and the butter produced from it, besides the advantage of keeping a whole year without salt, is whiter, firmer, and, to my palate, of a richer flavor than the best butter I ever tasted from cow's milk. It is a chief article of the inland commerce of these districts. Sandsending, a town containing from 8 to 10,000 inhabitants, is a marketplace much frequented by the Moors, who bring glassware from the Mediterranean forts, which they exchange for gold dust and cotton. Mungo Park was not able to remain at this place, for the importunities of the natives and the perfidious insinuations of the Moors warned him to continue his route. His horse was so worn out by fatigue and privation that he felt obliged to embark on the river Jaliba or Niger. At Merzin, a fishing village upon the northern bank of the river, everything combined to induce Park to relinquish his enterprise. The further he advanced to the eastward down the river, the more he placed himself in the power of the Moors. The rainy season had commenced, and it would soon be impossible to travel otherwise than by boat. Mungo Park was now so poor that he could not even hire a boat. He was forced to rely upon public charity. To advance further under these circumstances was not only to risk his life, but to place the results of all his fatigues and efforts in jeopardy. To return to Gambia was scarcely less perilous. To do so, he must traverse hundreds of miles on foot through hostile countries. Still, the hope of returning home might sustain his courage. Before leaving Silla, says the traveler, I thought it incumbent on me to collect from the Moorish and Negro traders all the information I could concerning the further course of the Niger eastward, and the situation and extent of the kingdoms in its neighborhood. 2 days' journey eastward of Silla is the town of Jenne, which is situated on a small island in the river, and is said to contain as many inhabitants as Sego itself or any other town in Bambara. At a distance of 2 days more, the river widens and forms a considerable lake, called Dibi, or the Dark Lake, concerning the extent of which all I could learn was that, in crossing it from east to west, the canoes lose sight of land for one whole day. From this lake the water issues in many different streams, which finally become two branches, one flowing to the northeast, the other to the east. But these branches join at Cabra, which is one day's journey to the south of Timbuktu, and is the port or shipping place of that city. The tract of land between the two streams is called Timbala and is inhabited by Negroes. The whole distance by land from Jenne to Timbuktu is 12 days' journey. Northeast of Mesna is the kingdom of Timbuktu, the great object of European research. The capital of the kingdom being one of the principal marts for the extensive commerce which the Moors carry on with the Negroes. The hope of acquiring wealth in this pursuit, and zeal for propagating their religion, have filled this extensive city with Moors. The king himself and all the chief officers of his court are Moors, and are said to be more intolerant and severe in their principles than any other of the Moorish tribes in this part of Africa. Mungo Park was then forced to retrace his steps, and that through a country devastated by inundation and heavy rains. He passed through Merzin, Kia, and Madabin, where he regained his horse, Nyara, Sansending, Samia, and Sai, which is surrounded by a deep moat and protected by high walls with square towers, Jabia, a large town from which he perceived high mountain ranges, and Tafara, where he was received with little hospitality. At the village of Sauha, Park begged a handful of grain of a duty, who answered that he had nothing to give away. Whilst I was examining the face of this inhospitable old man, and endeavoring to find out the cause of the sullen discontent which was visible in his eye, he called to a slave who was working in the cornfield at a little distance, and ordered him to bring his spade with him. The duty then told him to dig a hole in the ground, pointing to a spot at no great distance. The slave with his spade began to dig in the earth, and the duty, who appeared to be a man of very fretful disposition, kept muttering to himself until the pit was almost finished, when he repeatedly pronounced the word ankatad, good for nothing, jankra lemon, a regular plague, which expressions I thought applied to myself. As the pit had very much the appearance of a grave, I thought it prudent to mount my horse, and was about to decamp when the slave, who had gone before to the village, returned with the corpse of a boy about 9 or 10 years of age, quite naked. The Negro carried the body by an arm and leg, and threw it into the pit with a savage indifference such as I had never seen. As he covered the body with earth, the duty kept repeating Nafula Damata, money lost, whence I concluded the boy had been his slave. Mungo Park left Kulikoro, where he had obtained food by writing sapphics or talismans for the natives, upon the 21st of August, and reached Bamako, where a large salt market is held. From an eminence near the town, he perceived a high mountain range in the kingdom of Kong, whose ruler had a more numerous army than the king of Bambara. Once more robbed by brigands of all he possessed, the unfortunate traveler found himself, in the rainy season, alone in a vast desert, 5 leagues from the nearest European settlement, and for the moment gave way to despair. But his courage soon revived, and reaching the town of Sibidulu, his horse and clothes, which had been stolen from him by Fula robbers, were restored to him by the Mansa or chief. Camelia or Carfatora advised him to await the cessation of the rainy season, and then to proceed to Gambia with a caravan of slaves. Worn out, destitute, attacked by fever, which for 5 months kept him prostrate, Mungo Park had no choice but to remain in this place. Upon the 19th of April, the caravan set out. We can readily imagine the joy experienced by Mungo Park when all was ready. Crossing the desert of Jalonka, and passing first the principal branch of the Senegal River, and then the Falim, the caravan finally reached the shores of the Gambia, and on the 12th of June, 1797, Mungo Park once more arrived at Pisania, where he was warmly welcomed by Dr. Laidley, who had despaired of ever seeing him again. The traveler returned to England upon the 22nd of September. So great was the impatience with which an account of his discoveries, certainly the most important in this part of Africa, was awaited, that the African Society allowed him to publish for his own profit an abridged account of his adventures. He had collected more facts as to the geography, manners, and customs of the country than all preceding travelers. He had determined the position of the sources of the Senegal and Gambia, and surveyed the course of the Niger or Jaliba, which he proved to run eastwards, whilst the Gambia flowed to the west. Thus a point which up to this time had been disputed by geographers was definitely settled. It was no longer possible to confound the 3 rivers, as the French geographer Delisle had done, in 1707, when he represented the Niger as running eastward from Bornu, and flowing into the river Senegal on the west. He himself, however, had admitted and corrected this error in his later maps of 1722 and, no doubt on account of the facts ascertained by André Bru, governor of Senegal. Houghton, indeed, had learned much from the natives of the course of the Niger through the Mandingo country, and of the relative positions of Sego, Jenne, and Timbuktu. But it was reserved for Mungo Park to fix positively, from personal knowledge, the position of the two first-named towns, and to furnish circumstantial details of the country and the tribes who inhabit it.